Boker Tov. Today's Yomi is Bava Basra, Pei Hey, Bava Basra 85. We're going to start with the last four words on Pei Dalad Amabez, Rabbi Shmuel Damri Travayo. Rabbi and Shmuel taught together on the top of 85A, Pei Hey Amid Aleph. Now, let me say at the beginning, this Yomi is dedicated for Shemir, for the Chayalim, that's all for the Shviyim. And the Yeshua for Am Yisrael, on this East Tzara, it says on the top of Pei Hey Amid Aleph, Caleb Shal Adam, Kono Lo B'Kol Makom. So Rav and Shmuel say together that a person's utensil can work to serve as an acquisition, the kol makom, wherever they are, chutz mirashas harabim, with the exception of the public domain. Meaning to say, you bring your utensil in, Rashbam says, the purchaser and the seller have agreed upon a price, and even if he brings it into the domain of the seller, the purchaser brings his barrel into the domain of the seller, and then the seller pours in the wine there, and they agree they're going to sell you $50 for a barrel. And also, Rashbam says that the seller says explicitly, your utensil will be the acquisition of this. When I pour it in, you'll acquire it. And that's going to be a valid method of acquisition, except if they would be in the public domain. And we'll see that in the public domain, it's not going to work because Rabbi Yochanan explains he doesn't have permission to place his utensil there, so therefore it won't work. But Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish Damri Travayo, so that's the position of Shmuel that acquires wherever you are, except in public domain. And Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, they say together, it could even serve as a method of acquisition, even in public. And comes along Rav Papa, and Rav Papa says, little pligi, actually Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are not arguing with Rav and Shmuel. We just said that Rav and Shmuel say it doesn't work in the public domain, and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish says it does work in the public domain. The purchaser can acquire with his utensil even in public. So how can Rav Papa say they're not arguing? So he says no. When Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish say that it can acquire even in the public domain, it doesn't mean the same type of public domain as Rav and Shmuel. So he says, Kam Rishus Rav, Kam Besimta. When one is the actual public domain and one is a simta. What's a simta? A simta is a semi-public domain. It's the side alley off of the public, this area where they allow people to, like a loading dock in public, that's not exactly a public domain, but it's not a private domain either. So if my car if it's not a public domain, why do they call it the public domain? So the Gemara explains, the reason why they call it a public domain is because it's not a private domain. But since you explicitly have the right to put your barrel there, even though it's the public domain, therefore it's going to work as a method, as a place in which the purchaser can acquire something. And Hachinami Mistabra, it's logical, says the Stamma de Gemara, it's logical to assume that indeed Rabbi Yochanan, when he says that he can acquire even in the public domain, it doesn't mean a pure public domain, it means just in a simta. Why? Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan himself has a statement cited by Rabbi Avo that a person's utensils can actually acquire wherever he has a permission to place his utensils. Which implies that if he has permission to place it there, it can acquire, and if he doesn't, he can't. And so we see from here that since it would acquire, he would be able to acquire it in a simta, but not in a pure public domain. And Shramina, we see from here, this is the actual way to read the statement of Rabbi Yochanan. So now the Gemara says, Tashma arba midos b'mochrin. So the Gemara says, we're going to challenge these Amoraim, the Amoraim, Rav and Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, basically saying that the purchaser can acquire it wherever they are, except in the pure public domain. So we're going to have a problem with this from the Tosefta, because what does the Tosefta say? Arba midos b'mochrin. There are four distinct laws when it comes to sellers and purchasing. What are these four distinct laws? Let's say we're filling up a utensil. It's not clear from the first case who it is. We're going to say that until while he's filling up this measuring utensil that he typically used for selling, meaning to say the seller is pouring the wine into this utensil and the utensil breaks. So the seller was still in possession of it at that point. From Mishem Minismala Mida will cap. But once it's full, it goes to the purchaser. The Gemara is not defined which case this is. So Rashbam tells us that we're going to define that this is referring to a utensil that neither one owns, that they both borrowed. And so therefore, as long as it's not filled, it's in the domain of the seller. But once it's filled, it's going to be in the domain of the purchaser. And Rashbam explains that this was the reason why it was lent to them. One is to measure it out. The seller can measure it out. And for the purchaser to put his object. So as long as they're filling it up, now it's going to belong to the guy who's filling it up. And once it's filled, it belongs to the purchaser. That's how Rashbam explained it. That's the first case. Aramidas b'mokrin shon ismal amida b'mocher mishanem ismal amida lokech. B'medvar mamurim. What is this referring to? B'mida she'ina shel shneim. That's with a measuring utensil that was borrowed. But if this, now we're up to the second case, but if the measuring utensil belonged to one of them, Rishon Kaneh. So if it belonged to one of them, i.e. to the purchaser, every drop that falls in, the purchaser has acquired it. So that's the second case, that the purchaser acquires it with every drop that comes in. In the first case, it belongs to the seller until it's filled, and it belongs to the borrower. In the second case, since it was the utensil of the borrower, every drop that goes in, he acquires it. When do we say this? In the public domain. When do we say this? In the public domain, or if there's a courtyard, then neither one of them, we'll see what that means, but it's a courtyard that is not belonging to both of them. But if it was the domain of the seller, let me just, before we get into the third case, in the domain of the seller, but we see from here that in the public domain, in the courtyard that doesn't belong to both of them, that's when they're able to acquire. So we see from here is the question on the Morayim of Rav and Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, because it seems from here that they can certainly acquire in the public domain. We're just saying that that's when they acquire it in the public domain. But if it was the domain of one of these two people, but if it was the domain of the seller, then they wouldn't acquire it. So this is a question against Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish. We'll come back to that. Now we have the third case. The third case that we're talking about, we're on 85a, around 7 or 8 lines from the bottom. When do we say this? We'll repeat this. When do we say that the purchaser can acquire a purchase or of all purchase mocher, but it's the domain of the seller? Actually, it's Aval Bereshus HaMocher, and this is the third case. Hold on. So now we're up to the third case. Aval Bereshus Mocher, it was the domain of the seller. Lo Kana, the seller has not acquired it. Achi Agbiana, meaning to say the purchaser has not acquired in the domain of the seller until he lifts it up, until he does what's called Agba. That works even in the domain of the seller. Or until he takes it out of his domain. So let's just summarize the first 3 cases so we don't get them confused. So the first case is where they borrowed a utensil. They borrowed a utensil until it's filled up. It belongs to the seller. Let's say we're talking about wine. And once it's filled up, it belongs to the purchaser. Because that was the conditions of the loan of the object, Rashbam explains. Then we talk about, then we're talking about a case where it is somebody's utensil. Obviously, it's going to be the purchaser's utensil here. Then the transference takes place every single drop. Each drop comes in, it belongs to the purchaser. So if it spills at that point, the purchaser is responsible. And that only works, says the Brisa, if it's in the public domain. But if it is in the domain of the seller, or now we're up to the third case. So if it's the domain of the seller, then the purchaser has to either lift it up or he has to pull it out of his domain. But if it's the domain, now we're up to the fourth case, where it's just lokeach, the fourth case, if it's the domain of the purchaser, kivin shekibu of mocher Once the seller accepts upon himself to sell the fruits and he establishes a price, then the purchaser has acquired it, even if it's in the domain of the seller, and even if it is not yet counted them. And we're going to say because the utensil has been nullified vis-a-vis the purchaser's domain, it's like by his courtyard. And so therefore, look at Rashbam. He brought his crops to sell in the purchaser's house. Since the seller accepted upon himself that he wants to do this, and he says, all this wheat will be acquired by you for this amount of money, and the purchaser has acquired it immediately, even though he has not counted it. Because why? Because his rishus, the domain of the purchaser, has acquired it. And even though the seller, it's in the seller's utensil, the reason why the purchaser has acquired it is because utensil is nullified by his courtyard. And so therefore, that's the assumption. So again, just to summarize, so we have this, so we're holding it tight. The first case is where it's a borrowed utensil, and then we say until it's full, it's the seller's. Once it's full, it's the purchaser's. The second case we're talking about is where it's the purchaser's utensil, and then we say each drop that goes in, the purchaser has acquired it. But that only works in the public domain. If it was a domain of the seller, this is the third case, the purchaser has to either lift it up or pull it out. And the fourth case is if it's the domain of the purchaser, and once the seller brings it in and he has agreed upon a price with the purchaser, and even though it's a seller's utensil, the purchaser has acquired it because his utensil is nullified by the place where it is, and that's the purchaser's place. So now the Gemara says, well, wait 1 second. Katani Mia, this is why this is a question on Rav and Shmuel Rabbi Yochanan Shlakish. But we said from here, that if it was in the public domain and it was in a courtyard that didn't belong to either one of them, then we say under those circumstances that the purchaser is able to acquire. So we see from here that the purchaser brings his utensil, and if it's in public, he can acquire. It's a question of Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish and Rabbi Shmuel who say that you can't acquire something in public. So Gemara says on top of 85b, my Rav versus Rabbi Mamish, are we talking about an actual public domain? And we see from here that you can acquire in the public domain. The Gemara says, no, that's not what we're talking about. This is not a real public domain. It's consistent with what Rabbi Yochanan said earlier, lo simta. Where is he able to acquire in the simta? The simta is the side alley off of the public domain. It's a semi-public place. And the distinction is you have a right to put your utensil there, and so therefore it can acquire. So the Gemara says, but the two cases listed in the Mishnah where he says it works, or in the Tosefta where it says it works, is a public domain and a courtyard that it belongs to neither one of them, which the Gemara assumes that neither one has the right to put their utensil there and still acquires. The Gemara says no. The Gemara says no. What does it mean when it says Chatzar She'eino Shel Shneim? It's not that neither one has access to it, it's that they both have access to it. Neither one completely owns it. So therefore they have the right to put their utensil there, and therefore that's why the purchaser is able to acquire with every drop of wine that goes into his bucket or whatever, or every crop that goes into his barrel. So now Rav Sheshes comes along and asks the question of Rav Huna. We're going to try and bring an answer to it from our Brisa. So first the Gemara says, Ba'amine Rav Sheshes mi Rav Huna, Caleb shalokech b'rishus mocher kana lokech olo. Let's say you bring the utensils of the purchaser into the domain of the seller. Has the purchaser acquired it or not? So basically, Reuven wants to buy the wheat from Shimon. He brings his barrel in, and he says, put the wheat in here. Has Reuven acquired it? Now, from our Tosefta that we just read, it makes it sound like he only acquires it if it's in the domain of the seller, once he lifts it up or carries it out. So let's see what they answer. So first, before Rav Huna answers Rav Sheshes, before the Gemara turns to our Tosefta, the Gemara says that Rav Huna responds, this is the Mishnah, you probably remember it. We've already done it in Gittin 77a. What does the Gemara say in Gittin 77a? It says, that the husband throws the get into her cloak or into her basket, Hareza Muguresha. So presumably the woman is standing in the husband's house and he says, I'm divorcing you, and he throws her get into her basket or into her coat. She's divorced. And so therefore, even though it's in the domain of the seller, since it's the object of the purchaser, you can acquire because she's getting the get. So you can acquire under those circumstances. So therefore, it's a proof that your object can acquire in the domain of the other person. So the Gemara says, Amalei Rav Nachman was not happy with Rav Huna's answer. My time at Pashatat la me'ahid imachu amea ukli be'ucha. Why are you giving an answer that we already struck down with 100 blows of iron in Meseches Gittin? Meaning, say we had this exact same question when we learned Meseches Gittin, and we struck it down 100 times. Meaning to say we said why you can't bring a proof from this case in Meseches Gittin. The Gemara is going to give several different approaches to prove that this is not a good answer to this question. It's not indicative of whether or not, in general, a purchaser can acquire something in the domain of the seller by having to go into his utensil. First reason is Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. First of all, that case is different because the basket was suspended on her. So since the basket was suspended on her, she was carrying it. So of course it's not the same case as you bringing your utensil and him pouring into your utensil. This is a case where it's actually suspended on her. Rashbam says it's not dragging on the ground, and her basket acquires it. The dami lahagbah. It's similar to the case of hagbah, lifting it up, which even our Tosefta said is the way you acquire it. Lifting it up acquires it in any place you are. So that's the first approach. Reish Lakish says, it doesn't actually need to be suspended on her. Even if it's tied to her and she's dragging it, it still works as a method. But that's different than just putting her utensil on the ground and having somebody fill it up. Third approach, third distinction. Rav Abba says, no, she has the basket, even if it's on the ground, she's straddling it with her body, and so therefore it's kind of her domain. Meaning to say the husband doesn't care about that place, and so that place, it's like that place was almost rented to her. Fourth answer, her husband was selling baskets, and so therefore either there's a couple of ways to explain it. Either he doesn't care about the place because he has a whole storage place for baskets, and so therefore her basket is allowed to be there, and so it's different than just a general utensil. Or else we could say he gave her that basket, he sold her that basket. So it's possible to give a few answers to explain that case. And then Rabbi Yochanan says a fifth answer. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Makom Cheka Kanoi Makom Kalasa Kanoi. So Rabbi Yochanan gives the fifth answer, and he says, look, when you go into somebody's house, they allow your garments to be there. So it's like you own that specific place where your garments are, and so therefore this is a different place, a different explanation. And what's the reason for Rabbi Yochanan? It says Rava, Amarava, my time of the Rabbi Yochanan, a person doesn't really get upset about the garments of somebody. If you bring in your garment and it drags on the ground, the owner of the property is basically allowing you to come in, so he's allowing you to do that. So we see that again, what's our question? Can the domain of the purchaser, can the purchaser acquire something in his utensil in the domain of the seller? We tried to bring a proof from Tractate Gittin where a woman acquired the get by having it placed in her utensil or on her garments or her basket. And the Gemara gives 5 reasons why this was not a good source to prove it from. So therefore the Gemara says, okay, Pasha Lameha, let's answer from the brisa that we had said. Remember, or the Tosefta that we had cited. Remember, the Tosefta said that if the purchaser brings it into the domain of the seller, he only acquires it by lifting it up or dragging it out, but not through his utensil. Pashal or mehab or shus mocher will kana achi agviena or achi atziena mirushuso. He only picks it up by. He only acquires it by lifting it or by dragging it out, but not by placing it in the utensil. And my love, aren't we talking about a case here? Bekelev de lokeach. Aren't we talking about a case here where the seller placed it in the utensil of the purchaser, and still the purchaser did not acquire it? So the Gemara says, no, that's not the scenario of this Tosefta. What's the scenario? Well, bekelev de mocher. No, it's the utensil of the seller. The seller puts it into his own utensil, even though he agreed upon a price, which in the last clause will be a way to transfer it. In this case, since it's his domain, he only acquires it when the purchaser only acquires it when he lifts it up and carries it out. The Gemara says, "Umid the reisha bekelev de mocher, seifa nami bekelev de mocher." So the Gemara says, "Wait 1 second. If you want to say this case is dealing with the domain of the seller, and therefore the purchaser has not acquired it, well, then what about in the last case where we said that if it's in the domain of the purchaser has acquired it right away? If you want to say that, Ema Seifa say that case is also talking about Parashus Olokeach. That case is also talking about the domain of the purchaser. And we should say, and it says there, Kivin Shekibo of Mocher, Kan Olokeach, once the seller agrees upon a price, purchaser has acquired it. So why is he acquired it in that case? The Ibikil of the Mocher, and if it's the domain of the seller, on my Kan Olokeach, why has the purchaser acquired it? So look at the Rashbam. Rashbam explains, Lididach, according to your position, the Oslos Basra, you follow the utensil, and you say, and we don't say that the utensil has been nullified by the domain it's in. Why is the purchaser acquired it once the seller agrees the price? It's still in the domain of the seller. So must be you follow where it is and not follow the utensil. If it's in the house of the seller, until it will be the seller's until the purchaser picks it up. Shouldn't matter whose utensil. If it's in the house of the purchaser, then the purchaser will acquire it, even if it's in the domain of the seller. And so we see from here, the Gemara is saying that if that's the case, why is the purchaser acquiring it in the utensil of the seller? So the Gemara says, no, Seifa Asan L'Kelev D'Lokeach. In the concluding case, we're going to say that's where the utensils are in the purchaser of in the utensil of the purchaser. Because since this is the utensil of the purchaser in the domain of the purchaser, he's acquired it. And so we can't learn from here in a case where the purchaser's utensil was in the domain of the seller, we won't have a case. The Gemara says, how are you able to say that in the first case, in the domain of the seller, it's the seller's utensil, and in the purchaser case, it's the purchaser's utensil? Why don't we assume it's the same case? So the Gemara says, no, stama de milcha be mochar mani de mochar shlichei be lokeach mani de lokeach shlichei. It's logical to assume that in the house of the seller, it's the seller's utensil. In the house of the purchaser, it's the purchaser's utensil. So the Gemara is still trying to figure out an answer to this question. If the seller brings in his utensil to the purchaser's domain, is he able to acquire it? So Amarava Tashma, it says in the following brayso, Mashach Chamarav Upoalav. Let's say a person pulls on his donkeys or his workers. Person pulls on his donkey or his workers. Basically, the donkey or the worker has fruit on its back. and the person pulls the donkey or the worker, and he brings them into his house. Whether or not they agreed upon a price before they counted, or they counted before they agreed upon a price, both can go back on it. Why? Because he hasn't done an actual kinyon on the fruit. He only did it on the donkey, which was holding the fruit. And so therefore it's not going to be a valid kinyon. But but let's say he unloaded it and he put them into his domain, then Pasak Achal Madad, that if he agreed upon a price, then if they agreed upon a price, then neither one of them can go back because he put it down in his domain. Madad Achal Pasak, but if he didn't actually agree upon a price, he just counted it, and then under those circumstances, both of them could go back. And so anyway, we see from our brisa that if he removed them and he agreed upon a price, even though he didn't put it in the utensil of the seller, that the purchaser has acquired it by it being in his courtyard. And from the fact that the utensil of the seller in the domain of the purchaser, the seller has not acquired it, meaning to say, the seller's utensil is not essential because we're going to say it's going to be nullified by the domain of the purchaser. So, okay, you know what? Anyway, first of all, we should stop because this is really tomorrow's stuff, but we'll stop here and pick this up, but we'll start again from Rava's proof tomorrow. Anybody have any questions? Happy to address.